Economy class, sir. Now! Senior Flight Attendant Melissa Sterling ordered the old man to move, her voice sharp and final. The passengers on Flight 447 saw only a shabby elderly man in worn flannel occupying valuable first-class space, not understanding that Robert Hamilton's shattered leg from old shrapnel made economy seating torture. "This is my assigned seat," Hamilton said quietly, showing his boarding pass. "Move or we call security," Sterling snapped, forcing the 72-year-old toward the cramped back rows. His military bearing and controlled limp caught the attention of 3 passengers in rows 3 to 5. Captain Dan Wilson studied the displaced man's weathered hands and disciplined posture. When recognition finally hit him, Wilson's eyes widened in shock. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, Sergeant O'Connor," he commanded quietly. Then 3 SEALs rose from their seats. What happened next changed everything. The San Diego International Airport terminal felt different at 6:45 in the morning. The usual chaos of travelers had not yet begun, leaving behind only the soft hum of cleaning machines and the distant aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifting from the nearly empty cafe. Fluorescent lights cast long shadows across rows of blue vinyl chairs, most of them vacant except for the occasional early riser, clutching a paper cup and checking their phone. Robert Hamilton sat in row 3 of the waiting area, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. At 72, he carried himself with the kind of quiet dignity that came from decades of discipline, even though his left leg extended slightly forward in an uncomfortable angle. The worn copy of The Art of War rested open on his lap, its pages yellowed from countless readings. His small military-style duffel bag sat at his feet, forest green canvas faded to a dull olive, with frayed edges that spoke of many journeys. Bob wore a simple plaid flannel shirt in muted blues and grays, sleeves rolled up to his forearms despite the morning chill. His jeans were clean but well worn, and his sneakers had seen better days. Everything about his appearance suggested a man living on a fixed income, someone who counted every dollar and made practical choices over fashionable ones. Yet there was something in his posture, straight back despite his age, alert eyes that periodically scanned the terminal exits, that hinted at a different story. The boarding announcement crackled through the terminal speakers. "Flight 447 to Denver, first class and premium passengers may now board." Bob closed his book carefully, tucked it into his bag, and stood slowly. His left leg stiffened as he rose, causing him to grip the armrest for a moment before finding his balance. He had paid extra for seat 1A, spending money he could barely afford. But the legroom was not a luxury, it was a necessity. The gate agent, a young woman with perfectly styled hair, glanced twice at his boarding pass before scanning it. Her eyes moved from the first-class designation to his modest clothing, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. "Have a pleasant flight, sir," she said, though her tone carried the faintest note of uncertainty. As Bob made his way down the jet bridge, each step deliberate and measured, the morning sun streamed through the aircraft windows. He found his seat and settled in with the careful movements of someone who had learned to accommodate old injuries. The leather seat embraced him like a small mercy, and for the first time in hours, his face relaxed slightly. Other passengers began to filter aboard. A businessman in an expensive suit claimed 2 Bs, immediately pulling out his laptop and claiming both armrests. A woman in workout clothes settled across the aisle, already scrolling through her phone. Bob nodded politely to each, but received only distracted glances in return. 20 minutes before departure, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted dramatically. Raised voices echoed from the jet bridge, followed by the rapid clicking of high heels on metal flooring. Melissa Sterling, the senior flight attendant, appeared at the aircraft door, her usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice pitched higher than usual, "we have a slight delay while we accommodate some additional passengers." Behind her came a small entourage that seemed to fill the entire aisle. Rex Maddox, the Hollywood action star known for playing tough military characters, swept into the cabin like a force of nature. His perfectly styled hair caught the overhead lights, and his designer jeans probably cost more than Bob's monthly pension. 2 assistants flanked him, one carrying a leather bag that likely contained his collection of expensive watches, the other speaking rapidly into a phone about changing the schedule. Rex stopped at row 1 and stared at the occupied seat. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I need first class. I always fly first class." Melissa approached him with the practiced smile of someone trying to solve an impossible problem. "Mr. Maddox, your booking shows economy class. The flight is completely sold out, but let me see what I can arrange." Her eyes swept the first-class cabin and landed on Bob, who sat quietly reading his book, seemingly oblivious to the commotion. She studied his flannel shirt, his work-worn hands, and made a calculation that would change everything. "Sir," she said, approaching Bob with a mixture of authority and false courtesy, "I need to speak with you about your seating arrangement." Bob looked up, his gray eyes clear and patient. "Yes, ma'am. We have a situation with our passenger manifest. I need to ask if you would be willing to move to another seat to accommodate our other passengers." Bob glanced at his boarding pass, then back at her. "This is my assigned seat. I purchased it specifically because of my leg." He gestured toward his extended left leg. "Old service injury makes it difficult to sit in cramped spaces." Melissa's smile never wavered, but it seemed to freeze in place. "I completely understand, sir, and we appreciate your service. However, we have some very important passengers who need to be accommodated, and your cooperation would be enormously helpful." "Important?" Bob asked quietly. The word hung in the air between them. "Well, yes, Mr. Maddox has appearances scheduled, and frankly, the airline values all our passengers, but some situations require special consideration." Around them, other passengers began to take notice. A man in business attire leaned forward slightly, clearly listening. A woman with her young daughter whispered something and gestured toward Bob. The attention made Melissa speak more loudly, as if volume could add legitimacy to her request. "Sir, I need you to understand that this is not just a request. We have policies about accommodating high-priority passengers, and I have the authority to reassign seating when necessary." Bob set down his book and looked at her steadily. "High priority," he repeated, his voice still calm but carrying a note that made her shift uncomfortably. "Yes, sir. Now we can offer you seat 34F, which is a perfectly comfortable accommodation. 34 degrees Fahrenheit." Bob knew aircraft layouts well enough to understand what that meant. Middle seat, back of the plane, near the lavatories, no leg room whatsoever. 5 hours of agony for his damaged knee. The businessman across the aisle shook his head and muttered something about entitled old people taking up first-class seats. The woman with the child whispered to her daughter, "Some people just don't understand their place." Melissa stepped closer, lowering her voice but speaking loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Sir, I really need your cooperation here. If you refuse to move, we may have to involve security, and nobody wants that kind of situation. You seem like a reasonable man." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Bob looked around the cabin at the faces watching him, some curious, some annoyed, all of them seeing exactly what Melissa saw. An old man in cheap clothes who had somehow ended up where he did not belong. Rex Maddox approached, his presence filling the aisle. "Hey, buddy," he said, his tone friendly but condescending. "I really appreciate this. The airline will take care of you, I promise. Maybe even an autograph for your grandkids?" Bob looked at the actor, this man who made millions pretending to be a soldier, who had never heard a shot fired in anger or carried a wounded friend to safety. The irony was not lost on him, but his expression remained neutral. "I understand the situation," Bob said finally, his voice steady despite the pain that shot through his leg as he began to stand. "I will move." Melissa's relief was visible. "Thank you so much, sir. This kind of flexibility is exactly what makes our passengers special." Bob gathered his book in his small bag, moving slowly down the aisle as every eye in first class followed him. His limp was more pronounced now, each step careful and deliberate. Behind him, Rex slid into seat 1A with a satisfied sigh, immediately requesting champagne and snapping photos with his phone. As Bob made his way toward the back of the aircraft, he passed 3 men seated in rows 3 through 5. Unlike the other passengers, these 3 watched him with different eyes, alert, assessing, respectful. Something about the old man's bearing, his controlled movement, his quiet dignity in the face of humiliation, struck them as familiar. Seat 34F was exactly as he had expected. Wedged between a college student lost in his music and a large man whose elbows claimed both armrests, Bob lowered himself into the narrow space with barely suppressed discomfort. His knee immediately protested the tight quarters, shooting pain up his leg that he absorbed without expression. The overhead light was broken. The air vent did not work. The smell of disinfectant mixed unpleasantly with the lingering aroma of fast food from previous flights. Bob opened his book again, but the words blurred slightly as he fought against the familiar ache that went deeper than his physical injuries. No one offered to help. No one said thank you. No one even acknowledged what had just happened. But in rows 3 through 5, 3 pairs of eyes continued to watch, and something in their military-trained minds whispered that this quiet old man was not quite what he appeared to be. Sarah Mitchell had witnessed injustice before. As a seasoned journalist for the Denver Post, she had covered enough stories to recognize the moment when power trampled over dignity. Seated in row 8, she had watched the entire encounter unfold with growing discomfort, her professional instincts awakening like a dormant alarm. Something about the old man's quiet acceptance troubled her deeply. She pulled out her phone, not to photograph or record, but to take careful notes. The way he had risen from his seat with such controlled pain, the military precision in his movements despite his obvious discomfort, the fact that he had never once raised his voice or shown anger. These details painted a picture that did not match the narrative being constructed around him. 30 minutes into the flight, Sarah noticed the 3 men in rows 3 through 5. They moved with the same controlled precision as the displaced passenger, their civilian clothes unable to hide their military bearing. The way they sat, alert, scanning, ready, reminded her of her brother, who had served 2 tours overseas before returning home changed but proud. Bob Hamilton tried to focus on his book, but the cramped conditions made concentration nearly impossible. His left knee throbbed with each movement of the aircraft, and the college student beside him seemed oblivious to personal space, his elbow jutting into Bob's already limited territory. The large businessman on his other side snored loudly, occasionally shifting and claiming even more of the narrow middle seat. The flight attendant call button chimed from first class, and Melissa's voice carried down the aisle as she attended to Rex Maddox's requests. "Of course, Mr. Maddox. Another champagne? Absolutely. Anything to make your flight comfortable." Bob shifted slightly, trying to ease the pressure on his damaged knee, when a memory surfaced unbidden. The whir of helicopter rotors, sand in his eyes, the weight of someone else's blood soaking through his uniform. He blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present, to the confines of seat 34F and the persistent ache that would never fully heal. "Sir, you need to keep your bag completely under the seat in front of you." Bob looked up to find Melissa standing in the aisle, her voice carrying an edge of authority that seemed designed for public consumption. His small duffel bag had shifted slightly during takeoff, one corner extending perhaps an inch beyond the designated area. "Of course," Bob said quietly, leaning forward to adjust the bag. The movement sent a sharp pain through his knee, and he winced despite his best efforts to hide it. "And sir, please keep your leg positioned properly. You are encroaching on the aisle space." Several passengers turned to look. Bob's extended leg, the one he could not fully bend due to old shrapnel damage, was indeed angled slightly into the narrow aisle. He tried to pull it back, his jaw tightening as the movement aggravated his old wounds. "I apologize," he said, his voice steady. "The leg does not bend as well as it once did." Melissa's expression showed no sympathy. "Sir, if you cannot fit properly in your assigned seat, perhaps you should have purchased a different ticket. Other passengers need to be able to move freely through the cabin." From row 5, Lieutenant Jake Rodriguez had been watching the interaction with growing concern. Something about the older man's bearing, the way he carried himself even under pressure, resonated with recognition. Rodriguez nudged his teammate, Sergeant Mike O'Connor, who sat across the aisle. "You seeing this?" Rodriguez whispered. O'Connor nodded grimly. "Old school military. Look at his posture, even cramped like that." Captain Dan Wilson, seated one row ahead, turned slightly. As the senior officer among the 3 Navy SEALs returning from training exercises, he had developed an eye for recognizing fellow warriors. The way the elderly passenger absorbed disrespect without retaliating, the controlled breathing during obvious pain, the automatic scanning of exits even while reading, these were learned behaviors, ingrained through years of service. Sarah Mitchell continued to observe from her seat, her journalistic instincts fully engaged. She watched as Melissa made yet another pass through the cabin, this time accompanied by a senior flight attendant named Robert Chen. "Sir," Chen said, approaching Bob's seat with clipboard in hand, "we have received complaints about passenger behavior in this section. Some travelers have expressed concern about disruptions to their flight experience." Bob looked up calmly. "What complaints?" "Passengers have mentioned issues with proper seating compliance and aisle obstruction. We need to ensure that all travelers can enjoy their flight without interference." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Bob had done nothing beyond exist in a space too small for his damaged body, yet somehow he had become the problem that needed solving. "I understand," Bob said simply. "We may need to involve the air marshal if these issues continue," Chen added, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. Sarah felt her professional outrage building. She had covered enough stories to recognize when regulations were being weaponized against someone who lacked the power to fight back. She stood and approached the two flight attendants. "Excuse me," she said, her press credentials visible on the lanyard around her neck. "I am Sarah Mitchell with the Denver Post. Could you explain exactly what violations this passenger has committed?" Both attendants looked surprised. Melissa recovered first, her smile returning like armor. "Ma'am, this is an internal airline matter. We handle passenger issues according to established protocols." "What protocols?" Sarah pressed. "What specific regulations has this gentleman violated?" Chen stepped forward. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. Interference with flight crew operations is a federal matter." The exchange was attracting more attention. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening. Some pulled out their phones, though Sarah noticed they seemed more interested in documenting conflict than understanding its source. From first class, Rex Maddox's voice carried down the aisle as he complained about all the noise from the back. His casual dismissal of the situation, the comfort he enjoyed due to one man's displacement, struck Sarah as particularly galling. Bob remained silent throughout the confrontation, his hands folded on his lap, his breathing controlled. But Rodriguez noticed something others missed: the way the old man's eyes had automatically tracked the movements of the approaching flight attendants, the subtle shift in his posture that spoke of defensive readiness, the muscle memory of someone trained to assess threats. "Mike," Rodriguez whispered to O'Connor, "watch his hands." O'Connor looked closer and saw what his teammate had spotted. Despite the man's apparent frailty, his hands rested with the relaxed alertness of someone who had been trained in close combat. The positioning was subtle but unmistakable to those who shared similar training. As Sarah returned to her seat under threat of involvement from air marshals, she made a decision that would change everything. She opened her phone and began composing a message to her editor, describing the situation unfolding at 30,000 feet. She also sent a text to her brother, a veteran himself, asking if he had any contacts who might know about military passenger rights. The response came faster than she expected. Her brother's text was simple but alarming. "Send me a photo if you can." Something about this sounds familiar. Bob shifted again, trying to find a position that would not aggravate his injuries. As he moved, his sleeve rode up slightly, revealing the edge of what appeared to be a tattoo on his forearm. The design was partially obscured, but Rodriguez caught a glimpse of what looked like an eagle and anchor. "Captain," Rodriguez said quietly, getting Wilson's attention, "you need to see this." Wilson turned and studied the old man more carefully. Something about his face, weathered by age and hard experience, triggered a memory. The bearing, the quiet dignity under pressure, the way he moved despite obvious pain, it all seemed familiar in a way that made Wilson's trained instincts come alive. The airplane hit a patch of turbulence, causing passengers to grip their armrests. Bob's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of bracing like other passengers, his body automatically shifted into a position that would allow rapid movement if necessary. It was a response drilled into someone through years of dangerous situations, a reflex that never fully faded. Wilson leaned forward, studying the man's profile more intently. There was something about the set of his jaw, the way he held his head, that sparked recognition. The captain had seen hundreds of military personnel over his career, but something about this particular individual seemed significant. "Lieutenant," Wilson said quietly to Rodriguez, "I need you to see if you can get a better look at that tattoo." As the turbulence subsided, Melissa made another appearance in the back section, this time with a security clipboard and an expression that suggested official action was imminent. "Sir," she announced loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear clearly, "we have documented multiple violations of airline policies during this flight. We will need to discuss your behavior with ground security upon landing in Denver." Bob looked up at her with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the ordeal. "I understand," he said simply. But this time, Captain Wilson stood up from his seat 5 rows ahead. Something in his military-trained mind had finally clicked into place, and the recognition hit him like a physical blow. The old man in seat 34F was not just any displaced passenger. He was a legend. Captain Dan Wilson moved down the aisle with purpose, his civilian clothes unable to disguise the bearing of a seasoned military officer. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably as he approached, sensing the gravity in his demeanor. When he reached row 34, he stopped and looked directly at the elderly man squeezed into the middle seat. "Excuse me, sir," Wilson said, his voice carrying a respectful authority that made nearby conversations cease. "Are you Robert Hamilton?" Bob looked up, genuine surprise flickering across his weathered features. Few people had spoken his name in years, and certainly not on a commercial flight filled with strangers. "Yes, I am." Wilson's breath caught in his throat. The recognition hit him like a physical force, memories of military academy lectures and whispered stories among special operations communities flooding back. "Sir, would you mind if I asked, were you Staff Sergeant Hamilton, Navy SEALs Team 6? The entire section of the aircraft seemed to exhale collectively. Bob's eyes searched Wilson's face, seeing something there that spoke of shared understanding and mutual respect. "That was a long time ago, son." "Sir," Wilson said, his voice growing stronger, "were you part of Operation Gothic Serpent in Somalia, 1993? Bob nodded slowly, unsure where this conversation was leading, but recognizing something kindred in the younger man's eyes. Wilson turned toward his teammates. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, Sergeant O'Connor, on your feet." The two men rose immediately, their civilian clothes unable to hide their military precision. As they stood at attention, Wilson's voice carried throughout the cabin with the clarity of a mission briefing. "Ladies and gentlemen, please give me your attention," he announced. "The man seated in 34F is Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Hamilton, retired, 37 years of naval service, Navy Cross recipient, Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster." A hush fell over the aircraft. Sarah Mitchell's phone was already recording, her journalist instincts recognizing a moment that transcended ordinary news. Wilson continued, his voice steady but filled with reverence. "This man single-handedly rescued 23 American soldiers from a crashed helicopter in Mogadishu. Under heavy fire, with a shattered leg from shrapnel, he made 6 trips into the wreckage to pull out wounded men. He carried them to safety one by one, refusing medical attention until every last soldier was evacuated." Bob shifted uncomfortably in his cramped seat, unused to such public attention. "Captain, that's not necessary." "Sir, with respect, it absolutely is necessary," Wilson replied firmly. He looked toward the front of the aircraft where Rex Maddox sat in the leather comfort of seat 1A. "Every person on this aircraft should know who you are." Rodriguez stepped into the aisle. "Sir, you trained my instructor at Coronado. Petty Officer Marcus Chen always said you were the finest SEAL he ever served with." O'Connor added, "My father served under you in Team 6. Gunnery Sergeant Patrick O'Connor. He named me after you, sir. My middle name is Robert." The revelation rippled through the cabin like electricity. Passengers who had ignored Bob's displacement now stared with growing awareness and shame. The businessman who had grumbled about entitled elderly passengers looked down at his laptop, his face flushing red. Sarah Mitchell stood up, her press credentials visible. "Mr. Hamilton," she called out, "would you mind if I shared your story? I think people need to hear it." From the front of the cabin, Melissa Sterling approached with hesitant steps. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by the dawning recognition of the magnitude of her error. Rex Maddox followed behind her, his celebrity swagger notably absent. "Sir," Melissa began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea. I didn't realize." Wilson cut her off with quiet authority. "Ma'am, Master Chief Hamilton will be returning to his original seat. Now." "Of course, immediately," she stammered. "Mr. Maddox has already agreed." Rex stepped forward, his face pale with embarrassment. "Sir, please take my seat. I insist. What I did earlier—" He struggled to find words adequate to the moment. "I've played soldiers in movies, but you are the real thing. I'm honored to give up that seat." Bob began to protest, but Wilson placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sir, please allow us to correct this injustice." As Bob slowly rose from the cramped middle seat, the entire aircraft seemed to hold its breath. His movements were careful and pained, each step a reminder of sacrifices made in distant places for people he would never meet. When he reached the aisle, something remarkable happened. One by one, passengers began to stand. First the three SEALs, then Sarah Mitchell, then the businessman who had earlier complained. Row by row, the gesture spread throughout the cabin till every person was on their feet. The silence was profound, broken only by the steady hum of the aircraft engines. An elderly woman in row 12 stepped into the aisle. "My grandson is deployed overseas right now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for your service, and I'm sorry for how you were treated." A young father holding his daughter whispered to her, "That man is a hero, sweetheart. Remember this moment." As Bob made his way toward first class, passengers reached out to touch his arm or shoulder, offering quiet words of gratitude and respect. Some had tears in their eyes. Others simply nodded with newfound understanding. When he reached seat 1A, the leather embraced him like the recognition he had never sought but finally received. Melissa brought him a blanket and a bottle of water, her hands shaking slightly as she served him. "Sir," she said quietly, "I want to personally apologize. What happened today was wrong, and I take full responsibility." Bob looked up at her with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout his ordeal. "We all make mistakes, miss. What matters is learning from them." Captain Rodriguez approached from the cockpit, having been informed of the situation by his crew. "Master Chief Hamilton," he said, rendering a crisp salute, "it would be my honor to personally welcome you aboard this aircraft. Your service to our nation will never be forgotten." Sarah Mitchell had documented everything, her phone capturing moments that would soon spread across social media and news outlets. But for now, she simply watched as the aircraft transformed from a space of casual indifference into something approaching a shrine to service and sacrifice. Rex Maddox, now seated in economy class, found himself in conversation with other passengers about real heroism versus Hollywood fiction. For the first time in years, he listened more than he spoke, learning about sacrifice from people who had given more than he had ever imagined. As the aircraft began its descent into Denver, Wilson returned to check on Bob. "Sir, how are you feeling?" Bob looked around the cabin, seeing faces that now held respect instead of dismissal, understanding instead of judgment. "Grateful, Captain. Grateful for young leaders like you who remember that service matters. Sir, we would never forget. You and your generation taught us what honor means." When the aircraft touched down, something unprecedented happened. Instead of the usual rush to disembark, passengers remained seated while Bob was invited to leave first. As he made his way down the aisle, people stood again, many offering handshakes and words of thanks. At the gate, Sarah Mitchell caught up with him. "Mr. Hamilton, your story is going to touch millions of people. Is there anything specific you'd like them to know?" Bob considered the question carefully. "Just that there are heroes everywhere, miss. In every community, every workplace, every classroom. Sometimes they wear uniforms, sometimes they don't. The important thing is to see them, to recognize the quiet service that makes our world better." 2 weeks later, Sarah's article had been read by more than 10 million people. The photograph of 3 Navy SEALs standing at attention in an aircraft aisle became an iconic image of respect and recognition. The airline implemented new policies ensuring that veterans receive the honor they deserve, and Melissa Sterling became an advocate for military passenger rights after completing extensive training on veteran affairs. Rex Maddox quietly established a foundation supporting veteran services, never seeking publicity for his contributions. The experience had changed him, teaching him the difference between playing a hero and being one. But perhaps the most important change was in the hundreds of passengers who witnessed those moments at 30,000 feet. They returned to their communities with a deeper understanding that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and unacknowledged, carrying the weight of service with quiet dignity. In airports across the country, gate agents began looking more carefully at elderly passengers, wondering what stories of courage and sacrifice might be hidden behind weathered faces and modest clothing. And sometimes when they spotted a military bearing or caught sight of a faded tattoo, they made sure those travelers received the first-class treatment their service had earned. Robert Hamilton returned to his quiet life, but he carried with him the knowledge that his service had been seen, acknowledged, and honored. And for a man who had spent decades in the shadows, that recognition meant everything. The lesson resonated far beyond that single flight. Our heroes are everywhere, and they deserve our respect, our gratitude, and our remembrance. All we have to do is open our eyes and see them.